Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've seen some pretty incredible numbers come through from the latest inflation numbers. I know that you were on leave at the time, but the team in the office and my good self had a great time going through them. 6.9%, the fastest rate of inflation that we've seen since the June 1990 quarter. Not quite the 7+% that we might have been expecting. The market was picking 7.1, Infometrics, we were picking 7.4. But that sort of touch of softness, if you will, at least relative to what we thought, very much because of the government intervention in the fuel market, artificially lowering inflation realistically with a $350 million a quarter price tag from borrowed cash. So, it's a pretty difficult decision over what's the right bet there. Looking through the numbers, what sort of really did strike was that you are seeing the pressure coming both from those global factors, but also from here domestically. Tradables inflation, that's very much the global-based stuff, coming in at 8.5%, so it's very much very high. The fuel prices, of course, taking a lot of that forward, but again, limited in terms of just how far they had gone. We saw that the price of 91 fuel was up around about 33% over the last year. Diesel, though, which wasn't affected by that cut in the fuel excise duty, up 55%. And so you sort of get a feeling of how much worse it could have been. The other driver, of course, was on the non-tradable side. That's the more domestic-based inflation. That came in for non-tradables at 6% per annum. That's the fastest since we've been able to split out the tradables versus non-tradables starting in 2000. So you really get the feeling that those underlying core measures of inflation really are roaring. Part of the reason for that high level of non-tradables inflation very much around households, the cost of construction of building a new home up 18% over the last year, the highest again since the well into the 80s, and similarly you're seeing that just a huge amount of pressure coming through when it comes to the New Zealand economy effectively operating above those levels that that it can reasonably supply. We're trying to buy a lot of stuff, but we just don't have the stuff to actually bring in. And so when we looked at those numbers, realistically, Gareth, we're going to have more inflation from here, aren't we? And it is going to stick around for longer.
Yeah, I mean, it may not push too much higher from where we are. We're still looking for it to go over 7% in the next quarter's data, but getting probably close to a peak. But it's a question now of how long stays at those sort of above average levels, sustained high levels from here on. And we look at the sort of supply chain issues that you've mentioned, whether it's domestic supply chain issues, whether it's sort of fuel costs and oil prices coming through, international shipping costs, of course. More recently as well, we've had the outbreak of Omicron in China, which is severely constraining and hitting production through there. So that's going to cause more disruption in terms of getting inputs and materials and products as well, both into New Zealand directly, but also into other parts of the world in terms of the manufacturing process and other products too. You've got the ongoing situation in the Ukraine and the effect that that's having, of course, most critically on energy prices, but also disruption in terms of the sort of general economic conditions and activity across much of Europe as well. So all of those speak of inflationary pressures and holding up for a while. We also look at the labour market, unemployment rate at 3.2%, and people have said, well, there's not, businesses don't have much room to be passing on or to be giving out wage increases because they're already under a lot of cost pressure. But the reality is, with so few workers on the ground, my expectation is that businesses have very little choice but to actually try and meet those wage demands to try and retain their staff. And we're seeing in terms of the indicators around the labour market that labour turnover has increased. Businesses are reporting that it is at its highest in 50 odd years, and they're expecting it still to get worse from here. So there's major pressures there that businesses are facing. So while we might not get inflation much above 7 or 7.5%, if that's the sort of peak rate we're looking at, what is it by the end of this year? Are we still talking 6% and then through into 2023, maybe still 3, 4, 4.5% even? There's a lot of pressure in that system, and we know that the Reserve Bank has been slow to react. We know that the government has been denying any responsibility for having caused this inflation, and they say, well, we've cut the petrol excise tax. That helped bring inflation down. Yes, it did, but ironically, if we'd allowed those petrol prices to push up further, it would have impacted more on household spending and, in fact, arguably started to reduce some of that excess demand in the economy. They're still hell-bent on, stoking those fires, and it's turned quite political over the last 2 or 3 weeks in terms of the cost of living and the track for government spending going forward from here. But certainly no signs yet that Grant Robertson is, shifting from his approach and starting to pull back on some of that spending. So not a lot of confidence from me that government side in terms of stoking those inflationary pressures is going to change. Reserve Bank, of course, they've started to raise interest rates a bit more swiftly and started to say we're not in a great place in terms of inflation. So what do you see them doing from here?
Well, I think they've got to continue with that pretty aggressive track, that much more aggressive tone that they started to take in April. In my mind, they're going to have to follow that up with another 50 basis point increase in May, and then realistically more persistent increases throughout 2022, effectively drawing forward what they were already expecting to do into the here and now instead of leaving it another year, which, look, we've been calling for quite realistically for the last few months, making the case that, look, the sooner you do it, the better, the easier the medicine goes down, but probably more importantly, the less medicine you have to pour into the system, without letting it get away. And look, the Reserve Bank noted that themselves with their whole, stitch in time saves 9 idea. I mean, that was, in my mind, quite a robust communication from the bank over those expectations. I think as well, though, they've got to continue with that much more aggressive tone to put everyone even further on notice around what business cost settings and consumer cost setting practices are going to be. Because you noted before, Gareth, the worry really, and quite valid worry about a wage price spiral. And everyone talks about how businesses might now be able to pass it on, but we know that businesses are passing it on at the moment. Everyone is passing on any cost because you have to. You do that, or your margins get, so far slashed that you just can't operate. And so I think you will see that pass on, especially if we do start to see a further outflow of talent out of New Zealand. The pressures in the market are going to be intense, but businesses are, in my mind, very much on notice now that things have got to change, that there's sort of too much energy in the system. And in a sense, I think it's, there's no one party or part to blame inflation for. It is all the various factors. And I think we've got to remember that although the war in Ukraine and the Chinese lockdown are certainly uncomfortable at the moment, remember we had inflation of 5.9% at the end of last year. None of those two events had happened at that point. We do have, yes, supply chain disruptions, but we also know that where monetary policy is currently sitting is still stimulatory. And importantly, we also know that fiscal policy is still more stimulatory than where it was pre-pandemic. And a lot of people are talking about how the government isn't spending as much this year as it did last year with the wage subsidy. Don't argue with that. But the fact is they've still got more in there. There's still more energy and spending from the government than what you had in pre-pandemic times. The structural balance, the amount of money that the government is spending out versus how much it's got coming in is still, negative. So this government is still, even once you adjust for those one-off emergency supports, you've still got the government spending more than it's bringing in. It's still expansionary. And so again, you're continuing to see New Zealand with hot inflation at a time when we're still pouring more petrol on the fire. Things have got to turn around, and I'm like you, worried that things stick around for longer because those price setting behaviours have changed. People are energetic, if you will, about increasing their prices because they think there is more to come, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. With that, with sort of a real challenge around inflation, the worst inflation that we've seen in a generation, the inflation dragon is back, and we're going to have to watch it very carefully, not only to see how large it grows, but importantly, how long it sticks around before we can finally put that inflation beast back to bed. We'll assess where inflation goes and what the different drivers of all of those are and how they will affect the New Zealand economy on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.